The road home stretched longer than Marcus remembered. 4 years of war had changed everything, including the terrain his memory had held. Or perhaps it was Marcus himself who had changed so fundamentally that even familiar sights seemed foreign and strange. The dust of 1,000 marches clung to his uniform, which hung loose on his frame now, evidence of the meager rations and hard campaigns that had consumed his youth. His horse, a mare named Mercy that he'd requisitioned in the final weeks before the surrender, picked her way carefully along the path that led through the mountains toward the town of Redemption Valley. Marcus was 32 years old but felt ancient. He'd left this town at 28 with glory in his heart and fire in his eyes, believing in the cause he was fighting for, believing that war was something noble and necessary. He'd learned differently in the mud of trenches, in the screams of dying men, in the nights when he couldn't sleep because the smell of gunpowder and blood had worked its way into the very fabric of his being. War had a way of stripping away illusions and leaving only raw truth behind. The closer he got to Redemption Valley, the more his heart began to race. He'd thought about this ride for over a year, ever since the war ended in defeat and dissolution. He'd imagined it hundreds of times during the long march north, during the endless days of waiting in camps that seemed to stretch into forever. But imagination and reality were proving to be different creatures entirely. What if she had moved on? What if she'd found someone else, someone who hadn't spent 4 years fighting a losing battle in a distant war? What if the woman he remembered, brave, steady, faithful, had decided that a soldier who never came home wasn't worth waiting for? Sarah. Her name was a prayer on his lips, had been a prayer through every cold night and every moment of danger. Sarah Hartwell with her auburn hair and her quiet strength. They'd gotten engaged the day before he left, standing in the garden behind her father's house. He'd given her his grandmother's ring, a small diamond set in silver, and she'd promised to wait for him. "As long as it takes," she'd said. And he'd believed her then with the absolute certainty of a young man who thought love was strong, enough to overcome any distance or hardship. But that was before he'd learned that certainty was a luxury the war didn't allow. The town looked smaller than he remembered. The main street, once bustling with activity, was quieter now, many of the younger men having gone off to war just like Marcus had. Some of them hadn't come back. He'd known a lot of them, had stood beside them in battles that seemed pointless and terrible in equal measure. War didn't discriminate about who it took and who it left behind. He rode slowly through town, noticing the changes. New buildings, a boarded-up store. The church had been expanded. People on the streets recognized him and waved, but he barely responded. His mind fixed on one thing only: reaching her house. The Hartwell home sat on the edge of town, a 2-story white house with a large porch and shutters painted green. Marcus remembered every detail of it because he'd spent so much time there in the months before the war. Courting Sarah, building dreams with her, believing they had a future that extended beyond the military summons he knew would eventually come. He'd even helped her father repair that porch, had imagined bringing a wife and children back to this town, had allowed himself to dream of a normal life. As he approached the house, Marcus's breath caught. There, in the front window of the upper story, a single candle burned in the gathering darkness. Not the window of the parlor or the sitting room, but Sarah's bedroom window. The same window where, on his last night before leaving for war, she'd lit a candle and held it up so he could see it from the garden below. She'd told him then that she would light a candle every night, that the light would be like her love reaching across the miles, guiding him home. He'd thought it was a beautiful sentiment at the time. He'd also thought, with the arrogance of youth, that the war would be over in a few months. He'd believed he'd be back within a year, at most 2. He hadn't imagined 4 years. He hadn't imagined that war would stretch on, consuming years and people and hope. But there was the candle. After 4 years of absence, after all the uncertainty, after every reason to believe that Sarah had moved on with her life, there was still a candle burning in her window. Marcus dismounted on trembling legs. He'd survived battles that killed men on either side of him. He'd endured hardships that should have broken him. But standing here, looking at that candle, he felt more vulnerable than he'd ever felt before. This moment mattered in a way that no battle could compare to. This moment would determine whether anything he'd survived had been worth surviving for. He walked up to the front door and raised his hand to knock. For a moment, his nerve failed him. What would he say? How could he explain where he'd been, what he'd endured, why he'd taken so long to return? How could he know that she'd forgiven the years of separation, the long silences, the uncertainty? Before he could knock, the door opened. It was Sarah's father, Colonel Hartwell, who'd retired from military service 5 years prior. The old man's face showed shock and then joy in rapid succession. "Marcus! My God, Marcus, you've come home!" He grabbed Marcus in a fierce embrace, and Marcus felt the tension in his chest ease slightly. At least her father was glad to see him. "Is she—" Marcus started, but Colonel Hartwell was already calling up the stairs. "Sarah! Sarah, come down! You won't believe who's here." There was silence from upstairs. Then footsteps. Then Sarah appeared at the top of the staircase, and Marcus's breath stopped entirely. She was exactly as he remembered and completely different at the same time. Older, perhaps. More mature. Her face carried lines that suggested she'd worried during these 4 years, that the weight of waiting hadn't been as easy as she'd made it sound. But her eyes were the same, dark brown, intelligent, holding that particular warmth that had drawn him to her in the first place. Sarah descended the stairs slowly, as if in a dream. When she reached the bottom, she didn't run to him or throw her arms around his neck the way he'd imagined 1,000 times. Instead, she simply stood there, looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You came back," she whispered. "I said I would," Marcus replied. And the inadequacy of the words struck him immediately. 4 years of separation compressed into that simple phrase. 4 years of not knowing if he would survive, if he'd ever see her again, if love could endure such a test. "I kept the candle burning," Sarah said. "Every night. Every single night." Marcus felt tears forming in his eyes, something that hadn't happened since he'd witnessed the first major battle of the war. "I didn't know if you'd wait. I didn't know if you'd move on, find someone else, someone who could actually be here with you instead of off fighting a war that—" He stopped, unable to continue, unable to voice the things he'd seen and done. Sarah closed the distance between them and took his face in her hands. "I waited because I loved you. Not because I expected you to come back, not because I had faith that everything would work out, but because you were the man I wanted to build a life with, and I decided that if you never came back, if you died somewhere far away, then at least I could honor that by being faithful to the memory of you. And if against all odds you did come back, then I wanted you to know that you were worth waiting for." Marcus pulled her into his arms, and for the first time in 4 years, he felt like he could breathe. The war had taken so much from him. His youth, his certainty, his ability to sleep without nightmares. But it hadn't taken this. It hadn't been able to touch what he and Sarah had built in those months before he left. That fragile thing had survived across the miles and the years, strengthened rather than weakened by the separation. Colonel Hartwell had quietly moved away to give them privacy, and Marcus and Sarah stood in the hallway of the house he'd dreamed about for so long, just holding each other. Sarah wept against his shoulder, and he realized that she had carried her own burdens during his absence. She'd waited alone, in a town where other women had moved on with other men, where she'd had to endure questions and pity and the slow erosion of hope. She'd kept a candle burning in her window every night, a private declaration of faith that he couldn't see or know about. "I don't know who I am anymore," Marcus said finally. "The war changed me. I've done things I'm not proud of. I've seen things that I can't unsee. There are nights when I wake up screaming, when I remember men I couldn't save. I don't know if I'm still the man you agreed to marry." "You're not," Sarah said, and Marcus felt his heart drop until she continued. "You're stronger now. You're deeper. You've been tested in ways I can't imagine, and you survived. That man who left here, he was good, but he was also naive. The man who came back is someone I think I can trust with my whole life in a way I couldn't have before." They were married 2 weeks later, in the church in Redemption Valley, with most of the town in attendance. Sarah's father gave her away, and when the pastor asked if anyone objected to the union, the silence that followed seemed to suggest that even the universe approved of this joining. After 4 years of separation, after a war that had taken so much from so many, Marcus and Sarah were finally building the life they'd promised each other. Years later, after they'd established a ranch outside of town and raised 4 children and built a life rooted in love and commitment, Sarah would sometimes light a candle in the window of their bedroom. Marcus would see it from the yard or the barn and remember that night he came home. Remember how that single light had represented everything he'd fought through the war to return to. And Sarah would tell their children the story of the candle, about how she'd waited for a man who might never come back, about faith and love and the kind of loyalty that refuses to be broken by time or distance or hardship. She'd tell them that the greatest victories in life aren't won on battlefields but in the hearts of people who choose to love each other when it would be easier not to. Marcus lived to be 78 years old. He never entirely escaped the nightmares of war, never completely forgot the men he'd lost or the things he'd witnessed. But he spent those years with Sarah, building something good and true on the foundation of the promise they'd made to each other before he left. He spent them raising children who knew about sacrifice and loyalty and love. He spent them in a place of peace, a place where candles could burn in windows without representing fear or uncertainty, but instead representing something sacred, a love that had endured the worst the world could throw at it. When Marcus died, Sarah lit a candle in their window for the first time in decades as a final tribute. She held it there all night, a farewell to the man she'd waited for, the man who'd come home, the man who'd made every year of waiting worthwhile. And when neighbors saw that candle burning, they understood what it meant. They understood that a love story that had survived 4 years of war and a lifetime of ordinary struggles had finally reached its end, but not before proving that some promises are strong enough to hold against anything.